when we look at people and we look at success versus failure, people tend to pick one side or the other. It's because his parents were like this, or it's because, she went to the right schools. Is that a useful way of thinking about things?
Well, I think we're well past the time of thinking that it's nature,
right,
your genes,
just one,
or nurture, your rearing. And in fact, all of us believe that it's some kind of combination of the two. I'm offering, I think, a simple but alternative take on the role of nature and nurture, which simply comes down to this. For some of us, how we turn out, who we become, is more a function of our nature than our nurture. Think of those people as fixed.
Right.
In contrast, others of us are more a function of our nurture than our nature. Think of them as fluid, or as we might say, developmentally plastic or malleable. Now, it's useful to think in terms of two types,
right,
like I've just articulated,
right.
But probably it's a continuum.
Right. So that means then for people that are considered as, in layman's terms to put it, fluid, they are more impacted by what life throws at them, regardless of the gene pool that they come from.
And as I like to say, they're more impacted by what nurture or the environment throws at them, for better and for worse.
Okay.
That is, it appears to be the case that those very individuals, children in particular, who are most vulnerable to adversity, who are most likely to succumb and do badly in the face of a variety of adverse conditions, are the ones who flourish and benefit the most from support and enrichment.
Are there particular traits that you see to be able to identify which is which?
But this is what we used to call the $60,000 question, but with inflation is the $60 billion
That's right,
question.
Of course.
But what comes out surprisingly are a number of things. The first thing I discovered was that it looks like highly negatively emotional infants and toddlers, ones who cry a lot, get easily upset, have a hard time being soothed, they seem to be highly susceptible for better and for worse. And we've often thought of that as a risk factor for things going bad. And it is when things go
Depending on the
bad.
environment,
But it looks like it's what you might call an opportunity factor when things go well. It's almost like, well, what I think is going on here is one of the reasons these babies and young children are so susceptible to negative emotions is because they have a very sensitive nervous system.
Yeah.
Things register powerfully on them.
Yeah.
For them, sort of a disruption might be the equivalent of a fingernail scratching on a blackboard.
Right.
Remember how?
Yeah.
Where for others, that doesn't register.
Right.
Some of it's genetic, but fascinatingly, there's also evidence and theory to suggest that it may be environmentally inducible.
Oh, interesting. How does that work?
That nurture may actually promote plasticity.
Yeah.
And there are two ways that this is shown up. One has to do with physiological reactivity or responsiveness. A loud noise goes off right here, okay?
Yeah.
One of us jumps and hits our head on the ceiling. The other just sits there, okay? Well, our cortisol, our stress reactive system responds that way, greatly or not very much. Well, it turns out that for kids who are highly physiologically reactive, they look more susceptible to environmental influences, for better and for worse. In fact, if you think of some people like the Navy SEALs, or really well-trained combat people, or airplane pilots for that matter, they are all people who are not particularly physiologically reactive. You might make a comparison of a Obama, cool, calm, and collected. He doesn't, versus a Trump, who is all over the place.
Yeah.
So some of us are, get scared easily.
Yeah.
Our cortisol spikes. We're highly physiologically reactive, and some of us don't. And it looks like that may be, at least in part, environmentally induced. Some of it's going to be inborn genetic too.
Yeah.
Prenatal stress may actually promote postnatal environmental susceptibility.
Oh my God.
Now, we've often thought of prenatal stress as something that's bad for you, and it's linked up with lots of bad things. Well, guess what? Two of the bad things it's linked up with are highly negative emotionality and high physiological reactivity. So it looks like prenatal stress may be promoting the very emotional, physiological characteristics that themselves are markers of environmental sensitivity.
So as we're talking, there are two major implications that come to my mind. One for education, and I definitely want to go there. And then the other one, obviously, is for your home environment, that it's the older sibling that gets affected more than the younger one for a variety of reasons. But it sounds like that may not be the case at all.
Well, the truth is that if you look seriously, and many people now have, at the birth order literature
Yeah.
and what that does and doesn't explain, it doesn't explain anything. Birth order is an inflated, lots talked about.
I believe that.
But it doesn't go anywhere. What the issue is going to be is one could imagine an older child potentially being more affected by a divorce because it might be more likely to attribute himself the cause, I did bad things. But again, this probably depends, is this a more or less susceptible individual? And I started to talk before about early infant temperament.
What about the notion of resilience? Being able to weather what comes at you.
Resilience is typically discussed in the context of adversity. Does that mean with regard to all exposures and experiences, inputs, and with regard to all aspects of development, outputs? It seems unlikely. I look at myself. I seem to have benefited a great deal, i.e. been responsive to psychological and developmental training, as an example. But you know what? I think if you would have given me musical training with a maestro, it would have been water off a duck's back. It wouldn't have taken.
Okay.
So just that example to me suggests that we may be mosaics of malleability. So you may be susceptible to X and I may be susceptible to Y.
So what does it mean for parents if they understand that this is how children are potentially
Well, I think the first thing it means is don't presume that your child, all your children, or all children are soft and malleable like wet clay, or that they're all dried clay and fixed who they are. That within the same family, some kids are more malleable than others.
I believe that. So let's come back to the implications then for education. What would your suggestion be for a utopian world in which this is this is managed well?
Right now, we track kids, usually by talent. But imagine this. Imagine I'm a principal of a school. I've got 3 first grade classes, 3 second grade classes, 3 third grade classes, and so on and so forth. And I know, as I'm sure every principal knows, within each grade, who are my best teachers and who are my less best teachers. Okay, let's not say worst, but in other words, some teachers are better than others.
Right, of course,
okay.
yes.
Well, let's imagine we could distinguish kids who are more and less susceptible. And what if we took all those kids who were most susceptible and made sure they got the best teacher? Because they would, A, benefit the most from her, and B, be harmed the most from the less skilled teacher. And took the kids who were less susceptible and we gave them to the other teachers. Why? Because they're going to be undermined less because they're less susceptible. If the teacher is really horrific, and some are, then even those kids could be, quote, metaphorically drowned by that teacher. Nobody's resistant to the worst of the worst.
So the adverse has to be very adverse.
I think we're getting there at a theory and research evidence basis, but I don't think we're there yet in terms of we can do this and we should do this. In other words, we're not at the state of personalized, if you would, developmental, behavioral, psychological medicine. Okay. Having said that, what really fascinates me is that more and more people who do interventions and evaluate their efficacy are coming to appreciate the notion that, there's a lot of what the scientists call heterogeneity, which means just variation in efficacy. Some benefit and some don't, even though they're getting the same treatment. And so people running these programs are now starting to measure things like temperament or genetics. And lo and behold, what's emerging is evidence consistent with what I've said, that these programs, which on average look beneficial, actually are beneficial for a subset, but aren't beneficial for the rest, even though the overall average reveals a general effect. But that general effect is masking important variation. So again, I would say, just to be on the safe side, I would say in 10 years' time, we should be there, if we can get there.
All All right, I'm going to play a little game with you
Okay.
that we do on the show, just for fun, and to kind of help drive home some of the concepts that we're discussing here. So I'm going to throw out names of some public figures, and you tell me whether you think that they are fixed or fluid.
More
their
fixed versus
more
more fluid.
fixed or more fluid in their upbringing. Barack Obama.
I think I think Obama is probably fixed. Cool, calm, collected, born that way with a nervous system that supported that.
Hillary Clinton.
I think of her as fixed.
Really?
I do. I think of her as just a person who, she talks a lot about the influence of her father and, his curtain business and hard work and that kind of thing. And we all most of us tell environmental narratives of how we got to where we are.
Because how much of a genetic narrative can you tell?
Right, exactly. But I think probably this was a hardworking, achievement-striving, forward-looking, ambitious, sensitive, empathic person.
Regardless
Regardless
of what was going on. Mr. Donald Trump.
I think just the opposite. I think Trump is mercurial today because, and I think he was made that way.
Oh,
because from what I understand, his father was kind of a real tyrant, demanding, not very empathic, and the mother was kind of cold and distant. And I think what we ended up with is a very insecure man, and that was induced by experience and exposures growing up. And now we're living with the legacy of that.
I'm borderline feeling sorry for him, but I'm over it.
No.
All right. What about LeBron James?
I suspect that LeBron was sort of, a muscular, hardworking, disciplined guy from the get-go.
Robin Williams.
His comedic aspect. I think here's a guy who was probably susceptible with a very low threshold, so that things that you and I might not have found aversive made him uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Comedy becomes a way of coping with that. I'm again guessing.
Thank you so much for being on the show. I think this is just so fascinating, and it really is the future of where nature and nurture are going to go together. So I look forward to that 10-year mark.